Our next speaker is Ambassador Richard Schmierer. Ambassador Schmierer is chairman of the board and president of the Middle East Policy Council. He served as the U.S. ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman from 2009 to 2012. He completed his foreign service career in 2014 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. In 2013, he served as NEA Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. Previously, he was NEA Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq and Director of the Office of Iraq Affairs. Ambassador Schmierer was at Georgetown University from 2005 through 2007, where he published the book Iraq, Policy and Perceptions. He also has held in his distinguished career prior diplomatic postings in Iraq, Germany, and Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Schmierer.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, and good evening, everyone. Your Excellency, Ambassador Mulgari, other excellencies in the room, distinguished guests, it's really quite a personal honor to be able to be here to talk about someone who I also became friends with. I think not quite to the same level as my colleague Francis, but who's someone who really was a mentor to me and who really helped me have a successful and extremely interesting time as ambassador in Oman. As you've already heard tonight, and you'll certainly hear more, Oman is a unique country, and in many ways it is uniquely blessed. And I would say that its most recent blessing has been having at its helm for almost 50 years the most enlightened leader of the modern era, His Majesty Sultan Qaboos. The formative elements of Sultan Qaboos's upbringing, which Francis alluded to, are, in my view, a key to understanding his approach to Oman in the modern age. His education at the British Military Academy at Sandhurst, his service in the British Army on the Rhine, where I think he was exposed to some pretty outrageous behavior, which probably also affected his thinking. A year living with a British family in a small town in the UK, where he learned about local government administration. An around the world trip following his time in the UK, where he visited, among other places, the US, and then the several years which Francis alluded to, where he spent in the Royal Palace in Salalah, during which time he immersed himself in the study of Islam and Middle Eastern history, something which I learned a lot about in my conversations with His Majesty. This background led Sultan Qaboos to emerge as what I would call a polymath, that is, one with expertise not only in governance, administration, and military affairs, but in such fields, as has been mentioned, as history, music, architecture, and others. His determination to modernize Oman without westernizing it led to Oman's unique development path, including the preservation of its traditional social mores and even its appearance. As Sultan Qaboos himself put it in a 1995 written interview in the journal which my organization publishes, Middle East Policy, to quote, "I have borne in mind the need to preserve a careful balance between these two paramount factors, the acceptance of modernity and the retention of old established values." Indeed, not only has Oman retained its traditional look, anyone who has had the good fortune to visit the Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque or the Royal Opera House, Muscat, comes to appreciate the good taste that Sultan Qaboos instilled during Oman's transition. To understand the reign of Sultan Qaboos, I believe it is instructive to consider briefly the reign of his father, Sultan Said. Sultan Said had inherited a country deeply in debt and was concerned that this debt severely compromised Oman's sovereignty. Thus, he set as his primary objective retiring the country's debt. But this came at a high price, the lack of even the most rudimentary modernization, leaving to his son, Sultan Qaboos, to jumpstart the Omani development effort. Sultan Qaboos's mother, as was mentioned, was from a Jabali community in the southern Dhofar region. By all accounts, she was a remarkable woman with whom Sultan Qaboos was quite close. Her strength of character certainly infused in him a recognition of the importance of including Omani women in the country's development, which was a hallmark of Sultan Qaboos's rule. Sultan Qaboos's approach in the early years of his reign to pacifying and unifying the country, as well as to launching its overdue effort towards modernization, foreshadowed the wisdom that would come to characterize his long rule. He successfully put down the rebellion in the southern Dhofar region that he faced upon his accession, using a combination of military power and conciliation, that is, outreach to entice opponents to switch sides and join him in developing the country, many of whom did, some of whom still continue to serve in the government to this day, and can be very difficult for U.S. ambassadors to deal with, if you know who I mean. Sultan Qaboos's, you know who I mean. Sultan Qaboos's early international efforts included resolving the many border disputes he inherited. As he himself noted, if a country has recognized and peaceful borders, it has in effect no borders at all. And he developed the country's foreign policy described as friend to all, enemy to none. As he steered his country through a fast-paced modernization, Sultan Qaboos had to continually assess the mood and sensibilities of his people. In fact, he was able to quite successfully balance the varied values, goals, and demands of the Omani people, while always safeguarding Oman's stability. When circumstances arose, as they did with the onset of the Arab Spring during a time when I was there, Sultan Qaboos responded with several measures to further empower the Omani people, including new authorities to the country's elected parliamentary body, the Majlis Ashura, and introducing municipal elections. Sultan Qaboos's approach to developing Oman's economy was likewise impressive. Over the course of his reign, Oman's per capita GDP grew from $371 in 1970 to well over $15,000 today. Over this period, the country's industrial production and infrastructure also went from largely non-existent to extensive and modern. Given Oman's less bountiful oil and gas resources than its Gulf neighbors, Sultan Qaboos had Oman lead the region in such enlightened policies as privatizing utilities and monetizing state subsidies. At times, Sultan Qaboos also astutely leveraged external tools, such as the process of Oman's accession to the World Trade Organization and negotiations for a free trade agreement with the United States, as vehicles to achieve economic modernization in the face of an, at times, resistant merchant community. I think somebody knows what I'm talking about. Perhaps the capstone in recognition of Oman's economic development success under Sultan Qaboos came in the 2010 UN Development Program report that designated Oman as the country that had achieved the greatest development progress in the preceding 40 years. China came in second. I had the good fortune to engage regularly with Sultan Qaboos during my 3 years as ambassador, and came to appreciate the genius and benevolence behind his rule. I recall his animation in describing initiatives for new educational facilities and athletic programs for Omani boys and girls in the wake of the Arab Spring, and his patience and understanding in the face of sometimes self-interested demands by young Omani protesters. While correctly described as having no children of his own, in fact it is clear to those who came to know him that during his reign, Sultan Qaboos viewed Oman's youth as his children. Sultan Qaboos was often ahead of his countrymen in his vision and efforts to introduce suitable modernization to the country. His decision at the outset of his reign to gender integrate elementary education in the early grades is a good example of his wisdom and courage. It challenged the views of the more conservative elements of the country, but it has had the beneficial result of making Oman a normal country in terms of how the genders relate to each other. As an American, I am also grateful for the wise counsel Sultan Qaboos provided to U.S. officials as the region became more and more inflamed in sectarian strife in recent years. So let me close with a few words about Oman's recent role in regional and international diplomacy. In July 2009, 3 young Americans were detained by Iranian border guards while hiking in hills near Sulaymaniyah, a town close to the Iranian border in the Kurdistan regional government area of Iraq. In September of that year, I arrived in Muscat to begin my tour as the U.S. ambassador to the Sultanate. It was clear from the beginning that the case of the detained hikers was one of young Americans unknowingly being in the wrong place at the wrong time. To gain their release, the U.S. government sought out allies who might be able to assist. As the U.S. ambassador, I raised the issue with Sultan Qaboos. At his direction, Oman began to quietly engage the Iranians on the issue. The Omani diplomat involved quickly discovered that the Iranians were deeply skeptical of U.S. intentions. Now, it will come as no surprise to anyone in this room that Oman has very talented diplomats. So, drawing on Omani diplomatic engagement with Iran, I worked with the State Department to undertake small but symbolic steps, what we diplomats call confidence-building measures, to demonstrate U.S. goodwill and to convince the Iranians we were approaching the matter of the detained Americans solely as a humanitarian issue and not to posture politically against Iran. The patient Omani diplomatic effort paid off. First, one of the 3, the woman being held, was released, and then the 2 men were freed. This effort led to the first ever visits by a U.S. Secretary of State to Oman. Secretary Clinton visited Muscat twice in January and October of 2011 to thank Sultan Qaboos for his efforts and also to explore, on behalf of President Obama, possible Omani assistance in addressing the issue of the Iranian nuclear program. The rest is history. I think this anecdote speaks volumes about the wisdom, goodwill, and courage of Sultan Qaboos. He will long be remembered and appreciated by a grateful Omani citizenry and by people of goodwill the world over. As one diplomat who had the good fortune to come to know him, I can say that he inspired me as he inspired so many during his life. He will be missed. Thank you.